On the afternoon of November 3rd, 1896, 4 men left the mining settlement of Telluride, Colorado, bound for the railroad depot at Ridgway, 32 miles north. They carried 2 weeks' wages, personal effects, and a handwritten letter of introduction for work in the Gunnison Valley. None of them reached Ridgway. None of them were ever seen again. Their names were recorded in the boarding house ledger kept by Mrs. Edith Korman on West Columbia Avenue. William Archer, aged 29, from Pennsylvania. His brother Samuel, 2 years younger. Niels Halvorsen, a Norwegian carpenter, 31. And Thomas Byrne, an Irishman who gave his age as 26, though the census later suggested 24. 4 men, among hundreds passing through the San Juan mountains that season. Unremarkable, except for what they chose to do on the day they left. The weather had turned the week prior. Early snow fell on the peaks above 10,000 feet. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset. Stage drivers arriving from the north reported drifts forming on Dallas Divide and ice forming in the wheel ruts along the main route. Travel was not impossible, but it required caution. Most freight haulers delayed departure. The scheduled stage to Ridgway ran only twice that week, instead of 4 times. The Archer brothers had worked the Pandora mill since July. They were described in a later statement by the mill foreman as steady, quiet, and eager to finish the season with enough saved for winter. Halvorsen had been hired to repair structural framing damaged in a cave-in. Byrne had worked irregular shifts hauling tailings. None of them held contracts beyond October. All 4 had booked passage on the November 5th stage, but on the morning of the 3rd, Samuel Archer received a telegram. The telegram came from a distant cousin in Montrose, offering work on a ranch property near Gunnison. The offer was contingent on immediate arrival. If they delayed, the cousin wrote, the positions would be filled by others already in the area. The message was brief. No details about wages or duration, just the promise of work and a tight window. The Archer brothers brought the telegram to Halvorsen and Byrne. The 4 men gathered in the boarding house kitchen after breakfast. Mrs. Korman later recalled overhearing fragments of their conversation. They discussed missing the stage departure, losing 2 days, and the risk that the offer would vanish. Someone mentioned the shortcut. There were 2 routes from Telluride to Ridgway. The main road followed the valley floor northwest, then looped north through Placerville and wound up over Dallas Divide before descending into the Unremarkable Valley. It was 32 miles, exposed in places but well-traveled and marked. The second route was older, steeper, and less maintained. It cut directly northeast over Hastings Mesa, dropping through aspen and pine before meeting the Unremarkable near a place called Beaver Creek. On a map, it saved nearly 8 miles. Local men did not use the shortcut after mid-October. The elevation crossed above 9,500 feet in several places. Wind came hard across the open mesa. In winter, drifts formed quickly and landmarks disappeared. But the route was passable in clear conditions, and men in a hurry had been known to take it. Mrs. Korman told the county investigator that she advised against it. She said she mentioned the forecast and the reports from stage drivers. She said the Archer brothers thanked her but did not change their plan. One of them, she could not remember which, said they had walked worse in Pennsylvania. Another said they would reach Ridgway by nightfall if they kept a strong pace. They left Telluride just after noon. Mrs. Korman recorded their departure in her ledger and noted that all accounts were settled. They carried bedrolls, canvas sacks, and a single wool blanket each. No tent, no heavy winter gear. They carried provisions for 1 day, dried meat, hardtack, and a canteen. Byrne carried a revolver. Halvorsen carried a small hatchet. The Archer brothers carried nothing but their personal effects and the telegram. 3 other men were present in the boarding house that morning. One of them, a mucker named Joseph Krill, later testified that he offered to lend them a larger blanket. He said they declined. He said they seemed confident. He used the word cheerful. They walked north on Aspen Street, turned east toward the mouth of the canyon, and disappeared from the settled part of town. A freight teamster named Amos Drummond saw them passing the stamp mill around 1 o'clock. He waved. One of them waved back. That was the last confirmed sighting. The decision had been made. The shortcut over Hastings Mesa, 8 miles saved. One night in the open, a job waiting on the other side. Everything reasonable, everything within the margin of risk men accepted in that country at that time. But no one returned. Telluride in 1896 was not a new settlement. It had been incorporated for more than a decade. The mines employed over 1,500 men at peak season. The town had electric lights, a hospital, 2 newspapers, and a volunteer fire brigade. It was not a remote camp cut off from the world. It was a functioning municipality connected by stage and telegraph to Montrose, Ouray, and the railroad at Ridgway. Men came and went constantly. Seasonal labor was the foundation of the economy. Workers arrived in spring, worked through autumn, and left before the heavy snows. Some stayed. Most did not. The boarding houses kept logs, but there was no formal registry. If a man said he was leaving, he left. If he did not return, it was assumed he had gone somewhere else. The shortcut over Hastings Mesa was not a secret. It appeared on surveyor maps drawn in the 1880s. Stockmen used it to move cattle between summer and winter range. Hunters used it to access elk grounds on the far side of the mesa. In summer and early fall, it was a legitimate alternative to the longer valley route, but it was not maintained by the county. There were no stage stops, no cabins, no marked water sources. It was a trail, not a road. The men who used it were expected to know what they were doing. Self-reliance was not romantic. It was structural. There was no search and rescue service. There was no weather forecast beyond what a man could see in the sky. If someone made a poor choice and paid for it, that was understood as part of the terms. The Archer brothers had worked outdoors most of their lives. William had mined coal in Pennsylvania before coming west. Samuel had worked timber crews. Both were described as capable. Halvorsen had crossed the Atlantic in steerage, worked logging camps in Wisconsin, and walked from Denver to Telluride the previous spring. Byrne's background was less clear, but he had survived 2 winters in the San Juans and was known to handle difficult shifts without complaint. These were not reckless men. They were working men making a calculated decision. The shortcut had been taken before. It would be taken again. The risk was visible, but it was not extraordinary. Weather patterns in the San Juan range were difficult to predict. Storms could develop rapidly. A clear morning could turn to whiteout by afternoon, but early November was often stable. Snow fell, but it melted quickly below 10,000 feet. The heavy accumulation usually did not begin until late November or December. The men would have known this. They would have factored it into their thinking. Mrs. Korman's warning was noted, but it was not unusual. Boarding house keepers often cautioned against unnecessary travel. It was part of the social fabric. The advice was given. The advice was acknowledged. The decision remained with the traveler. On the morning of November 3rd, the sky over Telluride was overcast, but not threatening. The temperature was in the mid-30s. There was no wind in the valley. A stagecoach driver named Martin Schaefer arrived from Placerville around 10 o'clock and reported clear passage on the main road. He mentioned some ice near Sawpit, but nothing impassable. He did not travel over the mesa and offered no opinion on that route. The men would have heard this. They would have weighed it. They would have looked at the sky, felt the air, and made their judgment. The telegram created urgency. The shortcut created opportunity. The conditions seemed manageable. The choice followed logically. There is a tendency, when reviewing decisions that end badly, to imagine that the danger was obvious, but the records suggest otherwise. Nothing that morning pointed to disaster. Everything pointed to difficulty, perhaps discomfort, but not catastrophe. The men left prepared for a hard walk and a cold night. They expected to arrive in Ridgway tired and ready for a meal. They expected to send word back to Telluride that they had arrived safely. One detail stands out in the later investigation. A shopkeeper named Louis Fassler sold the men a tin of matches and a coil of rope on the morning they left. He testified that they asked about the condition of the trail over the mesa. He told them he had not been up there in weeks, but that a surveyor had passed through town in mid-October and reported good visibility and dry ground. Fassler said the men seemed satisfied with this information. He said they paid in cash and left without further questions. The surveyor's name was Charles Whitmore. He was located and interviewed 6 months later. He confirmed that he had crossed Hastings Mesa on October 14th, but he also clarified that conditions could change dramatically in a matter of days. He said he would not have recommended the route after the first week of November. He said he never spoke directly to the men. His comments had been relayed secondhand. This is how decisions form, not from ignorance, but from incomplete information, reasonable assumptions, and the pressure of circumstance. The men had heard enough to feel justified. They had not heard enough to feel alarmed. The gap between those two states was narrow, but it was everything. The trail to Hastings Mesa began just east of the Pandora Mill, where the valley narrowed and the canyon walls rose steep on both sides. The first mile was relatively easy, following an old wagon trace that switchbacked up through scrub oak and scattered pine. From there, the route opened onto a bench of exposed ground, then climbed steadily toward the mesa rim. The elevation gain was approximately 2,200 feet over 4 miles. By mid-afternoon, the men would have been above 8,500 feet. The air would have been thinner, colder. The light would have taken on the hard, flat quality of high country in November. Behind them, the town would have been hidden by the ridgeline. Ahead, the mesa stretched northeast in a broad, treeless expanse. No one witnessed this part of their journey. Everything that follows is reconstruction, built from terrain, weather records, and later findings. But certain things can be stated with confidence. The cloud cover thickened as the afternoon progressed. The Montrose weather station recorded the arrival of a low-pressure system from the northwest beginning around 2 o'clock. The temperature in the valley dropped to 31 degrees by 3:30. At higher elevations, it would have been colder. Winds at altitude were recorded at 15 to 20 miles per hour, gusting higher. Hastings Mesa is a tilted plateau. The western edge rises sharply from the valley. The eastern edge drops more gradually into aspen forest and eventually into Beaver Creek drainage. The surface is uneven, broken by shallow drainages and patches of exposed rock. In summer, it offers wide visibility. In winter or in poor weather, it becomes featureless. Distances are deceptive. Direction is difficult to hold without landmarks. The men would have had perhaps 3 hours of usable daylight remaining when they reached the mesa rim. If they maintained a steady pace, they could have covered most of the open ground before dark. But steady paces are difficult to maintain at elevation, in cold with loose footing and a dropping sky. Somewhere on the mesa, they made a second decision. This one was not discussed in a boarding house kitchen. This one left no record. But its consequences are visible in what came after. They did not stop. They did not turn back. They pressed forward into deteriorating conditions. The snowfall began between 4 and 5 o'clock. The Ridgway station recorded the first flakes at 4:45. Telluride recorded snow at 5:10. On the mesa, it would have started earlier and fallen harder. At that elevation, in that wind, snow does not fall gently. It drives horizontal. It erases the ground. Visibility would have collapsed quickly. 100 yards, 50, less. The trail, which was already faint, would have disappeared entirely. The men would have been walking on instinct, trying to hold a northeast bearing, trying to find the descent into the trees. The temperature continued to fall. By 6 o'clock, the Montrose station recorded 18 degrees. On the mesa, with wind chill, it would have been near 0. The men were not dressed for that. They had wool coats, work boots, and canvas gloves. They had no goggles, no heavy overcoats, no insulated bedding. They had planned for a cold night, not an Arctic one. At some point, they would have realized their situation had changed. The question is when, and what they did about it. There are no trees on the open mesa, no rock outcrops large enough to provide shelter, no natural windbreaks. If they chose to stop and wait for the storm to pass, they would have been exposed to the full force of the wind and snow. If they chose to keep moving, they risked walking in circles, exhausting themselves, or falling in the dark. Both options were bad. One was probably worse. Later search parties found evidence that suggested movement, boot prints, partially filled with snow, leading northeast from the mesa rim toward the Aspen line. The prints were found in late November, weeks after the men disappeared, and they were not definitively linked to the missing party. But the direction was consistent. The spacing suggested urgency. They were trying to reach the trees. The forest on the eastern slope of the mesa is dense. Aspen mixed with spruce and fir. It offers some protection from wind, but it also creates disorientation. In a whiteout, the trees become a maze. Distances collapse. Direction becomes arbitrary. Men have walked in circles 50 yards from a road and never found it. If the men reached the trees, they would have had a chance to stop, to build a fire, to wait out the storm. But fires require dry wood, and storms require patience. Men who are cold and exhausted do not think clearly. They make decisions that seem logical in the moment and are revealed as fatal in hindsight. There is a particular kind of cold that shuts the body down incrementally. First the extremities, then the core. Shivering becomes violent, then stops. Thinking becomes slow, then confused. The instinct is to keep moving because movement feels like survival. But movement without direction is just expenditure. It burns the last reserves. By full dark, the storm was at its peak. Wind gusts reached 30 miles per hour. Snowfall was measured at 2 inches per hour in the valley. On the mesa, accumulation would have been deeper. The men, if they were still moving, would have been walking blind. The last decision was probably not a decision at all. It was probably just exhaustion. A moment when the body stopped obeying. A moment when sitting down seemed reasonable. A moment when closing the eyes was easier than opening them. There is no drama in freezing to death. There is no final speech. There is only the cold and the body's slow surrender to it. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky cleared. The temperature climbed back into the 20s. The mesa was silent and white. The men did not arrive in Ridgway on November 4th. They did not arrive on the 5th. No one noticed immediately. The cousin in Montrose, who had sent the telegram, assumed the men had declined the offer. The boarding house in Telluride assumed they had moved on. The mill foreman assumed their contract had simply ended. It was not until November 12th that anyone asked a direct question. A letter arrived at the Telluride post office addressed to William Archer, sent from Pennsylvania by his mother. The postmaster, knowing the Archers had departed, forwarded the letter to Ridgway, assuming they had arrived. The Ridgway postmaster returned the letter marked "Recipient Unknown." Mrs. Korman was asked if the Archers had left a forwarding address. She checked her ledger. She confirmed they had departed on November 3rd. She mentioned the shortcut. The postmaster mentioned the storm. On November 14th, a formal inquiry was filed with the San Miguel County Sheriff. The sheriff's office telegraphed Montrose, Ouray, and Ridgway, asking if anyone matching the descriptions of the 4 men had been seen. No positive responses came back. On November 16th, a search party was organized. 6 men, including Joseph Krill and Amos Drummond, left Telluride on horseback and followed the shortcut route over Hastings Mesa. The snow had melted in the valley, but remained deep at higher elevations. The search party reached the mesa rim by midday. They found the trail obliterated. They found no tracks, no signs of passage, no evidence of disturbance. They descended into the aspen forest on the far side. They spread out and walked parallel lines northeast toward Beaver Creek. They found nothing. They camped that night near the drainage and resumed the search the following morning. They covered approximately 4 square miles over 2 days. They found boot prints, but the prints could not be conclusively identified. They found a fragment of cloth snagged on a branch, but it was too degraded to determine origin. On November 19th, the search was suspended due to incoming weather. The party returned to Telluride and reported their findings to the sheriff. The official conclusion was that the men had either perished in the storm or had somehow bypassed Ridgway and continued north. The latter seemed unlikely but could not be ruled out. A second search was conducted in late December, after the snow had stabilized. A larger party, including 2 men with tracking experience, retraced the route. They found no additional evidence. The deep snow made comprehensive searching impossible. Large areas of the forest were inaccessible. In January, the San Miguel County coroner filed a preliminary report. It listed the 4 men as missing and presumed deceased. The cause of death was listed as exposure, contingent on eventual recovery of remains. The report noted that the decision to take the shortcut was made voluntarily and that no negligence by third parties was evident. The families were notified. William and Samuel Archer's mother received a letter from the sheriff in February. Niels Halvorsen's brother, living in Minnesota, was contacted by telegraph. Thomas Byrne had listed no next of kin. A notice was published in the Telluride Journal and the Montrose newspaper. No claims were filed for personal effects. In March, a rancher named Thomas Lipp reported finding a bedroll near Beaver Creek, approximately 6 miles northeast of the mesa. The bedroll was water-damaged and frozen into the ground. It was retrieved and examined by the sheriff. No identifying marks were found. The rancher said he had walked that area in October and the bedroll had not been there. He believed it had been deposited during the winter. In April, the snowmelt began. The Uncompahgre River ran high and fast. Debris washed down from the high country, including branches, animal carcasses, and scattered gear. A wool coat was found snagged in a logjam near Ridgway. It was sent to Telluride for possible identification. Mrs. Korman examined it but could not confirm whether it had belonged to any of the men. No bodies were recovered in 1897. No bodies were recovered in 1898. The case remained open but inactive. The men became part of the statistical record. 4 more names in the long list of those who went into the mountains and did not return. In 1901, a hunter found a human skull and partial skeleton near the tree line above Beaver Creek. The remains were brought to the Montrose coroner. The skull showed no signs of trauma. The bones showed evidence of animal scavenging. The coroner estimated the remains had been exposed for several years. No clothing or personal effects were found nearby. The coroner could not determine identity. The remains were buried in the Montrose cemetery under a marker reading "Unknown." In 1907, a survey crew working on a Forest Service map found additional human remains in a drainage 2 miles west of the first site. These remains were more complete. The skull and most of the long bones were present. Fragments of cloth and a corroded metal buckle were found nearby. The remains were brought to Telluride. Mrs. Korman was asked to examine the buckle. She said it looked similar to ones she had seen, but she could not be certain. The coroner's report identified the remains as male, approximate age 25 to 35, cause of death undetermined but consistent with exposure. The remains were buried in the Telluride Lone Tree Cemetery. The grave was marked "Unknown, died circa 1896. No further remains were found. The locations of the other 2 men, if they died separately, were never determined. The forest is large. The drainages are many. The snow comes every year and erases what the previous year left behind. The shortcut over Hastings Mesa remained in use for another decade. It was eventually abandoned when a better road was built through Placerville. The trail faded. The landmarks disappeared. The mesa returned to silence. In 1934, a historian named Eleanor Marsh began compiling records of mining-era disappearances in the San Juan region. She worked for the Colorado State Historical Society and was tasked with creating an archive of unsolved cases. She reviewed coroner's reports, newspaper articles, and county records dating back to the 1870s. The case of the 4 men from Telluride appeared in her files as case number 83. She summarized the known facts in 2 paragraphs. She noted the lack of resolution. She marked the file incomplete and moved on. In 1951, the file was reviewed again by a graduate student named Robert Keene, who was writing a thesis on labor migration in the Colorado mining camps. Keene was struck by the specificity of the details: the telegram, the shortcut, the storm. He wrote a 3-page analysis suggesting that the case represented a broader pattern of calculated risk-taking among transient workers in the late 19th century. He argued that the decision to take the shortcut was not reckless, but economically rational. The men needed work. The work required speed. The shortcut offered speed. The risk was acknowledged, but deemed acceptable. Keene's thesis was filed in the University of Colorado Library and largely forgotten. The case slipped back into obscurity. In 1982, a journalist named Peter Caldwell published a regional history book titled Lost in the San Juans. The book included a chapter on the four men. Caldwell added details that do not appear in the original records. He described the men's thoughts as they walked into the storm. He imagined their final conversations. He wrote with authority about things that could not be known. The chapter was criticized by local historians for its speculative tone. Caldwell defended the approach, arguing that storytelling required interpretation. The debate was brief and inconclusive. The book sold modestly and went out of print within 5 years. The actual records remain thin. The boarding house ledger, preserved in the Telluride Historical Museum, lists the men's names and departure date. The coroner's reports, held in the county archives in Montrose, provide clinical summaries. The newspaper notices, scanned and digitized, offer glimpses of public reaction, but the men themselves remain shadows. What is certain is this: 4 men made a choice. The choice was based on incomplete information, economic pressure, and an assessment of risk that proved inaccurate. The inaccuracy was not absurd. It was marginal. A few degrees of temperature, a few hours of timing, a few miles of distance. The kind of margins that separate success from disaster in any frontier environment. The warning was given. The warning was heard. The warning was weighed and set aside. Not because the men were foolish, but because the warning competed with other pressures. The need for work, the fear of lost opportunity, the confidence that comes from having survived similar situations before. Hindsight makes the decision seem obvious. But hindsight is a form of certainty that did not exist on the afternoon of November 3rd, 1896. What existed was a gray sky, a cold wind, and 4 men trying to make the best choice they could with the information they had. The shortcut saved 8 miles. It cost 4 lives. The equation is clean in retrospect. It was not clean at the time. In 2003, the Telluride Historical Museum mounted an exhibition on mining-era labor and migration. One wall displayed photographs of boarding houses, mine entrances, and groups of workers. Another wall displayed personal effects recovered from various sites. A tin cup, a pocket watch, a tarnished belt buckle. The buckle may have belonged to one of the 4 men. The museum label reads Unknown Origin, circa 1896, recovered Beaver Creek drainage. Visitors walk past it without pausing. There is no way to know what it represents. There is no story attached. But the story exists. It exists in the ledger, in the coroner's files, in the surveyor's testimony, in the search reports. It exists in the gap between the decision and the outcome. It exists in the question that has no answer. What would they have done differently if they had known? The answer is probably everything. The answer is probably nothing, because knowing requires information, and information requires time, and time was the one thing they did not have. The shortcut is still there. The mesa is still open. The wind still comes hard across the exposed ground in November. The trees still stand where the men tried to reach them. The snow still falls and erases the tracks. No monument marks the place. No trail sign warns against the route. The land has absorbed what happened and moved on, but the ledger remains, and the names remain. William Archer, Samuel Archer, Niels Halvorsen, Thomas Byrne. 4 men who walked into a storm because a telegram arrived at the wrong time and a shortcut seemed reasonable. They ignored the warning. They took the shortcut. No one returned.